Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the Kevin Michael Grace Show. And I'll begin with wishing all of my Canadian viewers a happy Victoria Day. It's a beautiful day here in Victoria. But I want to talk about first, let's see, how would we describe him? Netflix executive producer. Barack Obama. Apparently, he's going to be the first billionaire ex-president of the United States. Barack Obama gave a virtual online commencement address. And according to Breitbart, he advised 2020 graduates to give up on the adults currently in charge and chart a new way forward for the world. The old ways of doing things just don't work, Obama said. He did not specifically criticize President Donald Trump, but had a lot of criticism for adults and current people in power. All those adults that you used to think were in charge and knew what they were doing, turns out they don't have all the answers. A lot of them aren't even asking the right questions. He added that adults with fancy titles and important jobs sometimes behave like little kids. Doing what feels good, what's convenient, what's easy, that's what little kids think. Unfortunately, a lot of so-called grown-ups, including some with fancy titles and important jobs, still feel that way, which is why things are so screwed up, he said. Obama said that the coronavirus pandemic only heightened the current divisions and social injustices, such as economic equality, racial disparities, and the lack of universal health care. He sympathized with the graduates, noting that they were already struggling with the added pressures of social media, reports of school shootings, and the specter of climate change. Obama tried to cheer them up by noting that even though they were missing their graduation ceremonies, they would not have to sit through long speeches. Not that many people look good in those great caps, especially if you have big ears like me, he said. A little joke there. The president offered a lot of advice, but not a lot of hope, particularly about attending college in the fall. If you planned on going away to college, getting dropped off on campus on fall, that's no longer a given, he said. He acknowledged that he was one of the old guys, but urged them to leave the past behind and move the world forward. Yes, year zero, according to Barack Obama, who was getting down with the kids, as they used to say. Don't listen to those adults. Listen to yourself. You're 17, 18 years old. You know everything about the world. Take a page from Greta Thunberg, who is the genius, who is an expert on the climate emergency and also apparently on coronavirus. There is no end to this young woman's accomplishments. Donald Trump was quick to respond to the Netflix executive producer. He said, look, he was an incompetent president. That's all I can say. Grossly incompetent. Yes, to the point. What were Barack Obama's accomplishments? Well, I guess there's Obamacare, and that turned sour really quickly, and they stopped calling it Obamacare. And there was that deal with Iran, which has been dismantled. So effectively, he had no accomplishments. He had an opportunity, as I pointed out earlier, to take on Wall Street and to punish those who were responsible for the debacle of 2007, 2008. He did nothing in that regard. He kept America in Iraq and Afghanistan fighting forever wars. Apparently, he thought that he was pretty good at droning people to death. And you might recall that he claimed the right to kill anyone in the United States or the rest of the world for any reason or none. Karl Rove called Barack Obama's speech a political drive-by shooting. Yeah, I suppose so, to the extent that people remember Barack Obama and his presidency. I saw that Whoopi Goldberg, who is a perpetual font of wisdom, said that the only reason that the right had any problem with Barack Obama is that he is black. Well, I don't know, he's at least half white. Trump is effectively at war with Obama and his former vice president, Joe Biden. Again, from Breitbart, Trump said at the White House Monday he had no doubt that Obama and Biden were personally involved with the Russia hoax investigation into his campaign. The president reacted to Attorney General William Barr, who said Monday that he did not expect the Justice Department to launch a criminal investigation against either Obama or Biden based on his knowledge of the investigation by U.S. Attorney John Durham. I've no doubt that they were involved in this hoax, one of the worst things ever to befall this country in terms of political scandal, Trump said. I've absolutely no doubt that Obama and Biden were involved. He described this as the illegal takedown of a president. But he continues that he had confidence in Barr, whom he described as an honorable attorney general who would do an honorable job. Good cop, bad cop routine, seems to me. And we find out some medical news, which I'll get to in a minute, that Donald Trump is taking an anti-malarial drug, which is been said to be useful in combating COVID-19 or acting as a prophylactic against it. Molly Hemingway writes in The Federalist, as new details emerge about the Obama administration's broad spying and leaking campaign against the incoming Trump administration, reporters have a choice to make about whether to cover this story honestly at long last. There is a brief window of time afforded the media to get the story right. They should take advantage of it. Journalist Lee Smith already noted the seriousness of the problem facing legacy media after the implosion of the Russia collusion conspiracy theory they peddled. Quote, Americans still want and need accurate information on which to base their decisions about their own lives and the path that the country should take. But neither the legacy media nor the expert class it sustains is likely to survive the post-dossier era in any recognizable form. For them, Russiagate is an extinction-level event. Going back to what the Netflix producer Barack Obama had to say, he was railing against experts and people in fancy titles. But it's a strange thing for him to have said because the anti-Trump case with regard to COVID-19 is that Trump hasn't been listening to the experts. He hasn't been listening to the men and women with fancy titles. He has been ignoring science. Hemingway continues, many of our supposedly smart media elites are dinosaurs who are completely unaware of the asteroid headed right at them. Instead, they are doing their part in an all-hands-on-deck effort to continue pushing out Democratic talking points that got them into the mess. This week, that meant they regurgitated the Democratic claim that the Obama administration's spying and leaking was normal, and that to be concerned about it is nothing more than a distraction. The less deft at pushing out the partisan talking points include MSNBC's Brian Williams, who literally asked implicated CIA Chief John Brennan if he could, quote, once and for all, explain to people who had heard about the scandal despite his corporation's best efforts why it was no big deal. Josh Marshall of Talking Points Memo complained that a biased NBC News piece that itself attempted to wave away the scandal was not biased enough for his liking. The Daily Beast's Sam Stein begged Axios not to cover the issue lest it help Trump in the way that covering Hillary Clinton's email scandal may have helped Trump. Susan Glasser at The New Yorker suggested that acknowledging the Obama administration's recorded attempts to undermine a duly elected administration through spying and leaking was a form of political agitprop. Her husband, Peter Baker, over at the New York Times, took the same line, but went with the authoritative gaslighting approach, in which he suggested it was odd that Trump would want to correct the false narrative that he was a traitor to his country and replace it with the truth that he was the victim of a coordinated attack to spy in his campaign, criminally leak against him, and force him out of office. CNN's Jake Tapper, a journalist implicated in one of the early Russia hoax stories, reported for duty to spread this partisan talking point as well. Many of these people are simply in too deep. They're not giving back the awards they got for peddling the false story uncritically. Well, no, I think that Molly Hemingway is being absolutely sincere, but there's no chance of the mainstream media admitting that it was wrong in conjuring up Russiagate or in peddling these lies from disgruntled members of the deep state. The media, the elite, it doesn't like to admit that it's wrong for the obvious reason. Well, the media and the elites have been so wrong so often that people would ask the question, why are you still there? Why haven't you retired to raise peacocks or whatever? According to Daily Mail, Trump says he has been taking anti-malaria drug hydroxychloroquine to prevent COVID-19 for a week and a half because good things are being said about it, calls warnings it is dangerous, phony, and reveals he demanded it from the White House doctor. Trump said he does not have the disease. He said he's taken one dose of Z-Pak antibiotic and is taking a zinc supplement. Trump requested the medication from the White House physician. It has potentially serious side effects, including to the heart. And the Independent in London, a typical story, essentially, Trump is an idiot because he has had heart problems in the past. Of course, now we're worried about Trump's health. Bernie Sanders had a heart attack, and that didn't seem to knock him out of the race, whereas Joe Biden is falling apart as we watch. But, yeah, look, here's Joe Biden with a creepy Joker face. Trump's coronavirus response nakedly xenophobic. It's from Breitbart. He claimed Monday that President Donald Trump's response to the deadly Chinese coronavirus pandemic has fanned the flames of hate and fear and naked xenophobia against Asian Americans, according to The Hill. Now, Joe Biden doesn't even know what day it is, but when Trump implemented the travel ban against China, Biden thought that this was a terrible thing to do because of xenophobia, racism, and the usual suspects. Then, what seems like only a couple of weeks ago, he claimed that he had publicly praised Trump for his travel ban. Now he's back to position one. The pandemic has unleashed familiar forces of hate, fear, and xenophobia that he always flames. They have always existed in this society, but this president brought it with him. He has brought with it a new rash of racial messages, verbal and physical attacks, and other acts of hate, some subtle, some overt, against the Asian American and Pacific Islanders. Yes, I'm sure the Samoans in America are cowering in fear because of what Trump has said and done with regard to coronavirus. Yes, the article says hysterical xenophobia. That's what he called the travel ban. Biden did on January 31st. And then in April, he said Joe Biden supports travel bans that are guided by medical experts, advocated by public health officials, and backed by a full strategy, Biden's campaign manager said. Science supported this ban, therefore he did too. Kate Bedingfeld, that's the woman's name, claimed that Biden's accusation, it's difficult to read these stories because they're all written so hastily now and they're not really properly edited, so they are just chock full of spelling and grammatical errors. Yes, Trump called it the Chinese virus, and this was very bad. Apparently, can't point out that it actually did come from China. And yes, we had a momentous political story over the weekend. People were gnashing their teeth and pulling out their hair across America. Congressman Justin Amash has abandoned his libertarian bid for the White House after less than a month, according to the Associated Press. Yes, I suppose he realized that the Manchurian candidate, Amash, was not going to go very far, particularly these days. Amash and his brothers have business ties to China. They're very fond of China, which you would think would be an odd thing for a libertarian to do. But of course, it's the libertarian view that capitalism, a free market, has such remarkable properties that, I don't know, the Chinese communists will stop being communists. All the evidence is on the other side, but that doesn't really seem to make any difference to these people. Let's see what's happening in the chat. Yes, Don from Beyond says, sounds like never trust anyone over 30. Recycled communist brainwashing. There was a picture of Donald Trump released, a heroic picture, where he looked stern and unyielding. And this led to a barrage of comments, many thousands on Twitter, saying that Trump did not look human, that there was no empathy to the man. And one responded with a picture of Barack Obama when he was president, down on his hands and knees with a toddler messing about. I don't know why one would want the President of the United States to be pictured on his hands and his knees, because it's redolent of submission. But no, Obama was, again, look at the man. There's nothing there. He is the very epitome of the empty suit. Oh, and of course he wore a tan suit once, and that's the real scandal. This is how great the left is at memeing. Yes, as David Wright says, Obama's accomplishment may be as positioning himself as the first ex-president billionaire. For what example? For what? He's shown business acumen? Not to my knowledge. I'll repeat it again. These are effectively ex post facto bribes. Yes, Brian Williams was this Nikolic. He's that liar that reports fake news. It's a funny thing about these people that they have a habit of making up stories about themselves, you know, their own bravery, combat zones, whatever. I don't know that anyone is really expecting a talking head like Brian Williams to display personal bravery, but they just can't stop it. As far as racism goes, Obama was a race baiter supreme, and you will recall that several American cities caught on fire during his presidency. While he was arguing disastrously in a split screen, I think it was Ferguson that was being burned down, or Baltimore being burned down, that you know, one had to really respect the views of the protesters. VCT says, responding to Le Comte de Borges, I am at my wit's end. The Dow is out of control and the VIX is down. Mad world. I don't know. I suppose this is what Kunstler calls this vanished money. You know, the Fed can just, you know, get that money printer going, and that's going to solve all the problems. Buddy says apparently the number of newly opened brokerage accounts has exploded in the last 2 months. Well, it's good to see that essential jobs are being created. Jules Roy says paleo-libertarian Lou Rockwell was a big China supporter in the 1990s. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to say about that. Lou Rockwell's site, what they republished me a couple of times, and Lou Rockwell was aligned for a while with Pat Buchanan and Murray Rothbard. Okay, let's go back to the same old story, I guess you could call it. Oh, yeah. The Price of Matriarchy. There's a video that was sent to me, taken in Oslo, Norway on May the 14th. Watch Norway's Prime Minister and other ministers do social distance dance. Yeah. Norway's Prime Minister Erna Solberg and some of her ministers recorded a social distance dance on Thursday to celebrate Norway's National Day on Sunday. She's a stout woman, I must say that. This is, they're boogalooing there, seriously, making hand gestures, hands behind the head. It is cringe. It is pure cringe. I guess this is part of what they mean when they say we're all in this together. Norway is a pretty serious country, actually, and yet their leaders do this kind of thing, to get down with the kids. I've been alerted by YouTube that this video comes from CGTN, and that CGTN is funded in whole or in part by the Chinese government. And that is the China Global Television Network. I'm reading from Wikipedia here. Formerly CCTV International is a group of 6 international multi-language television channels owned and operated by China Central Television, a state-owned media organization. It is registered under the State Council of the People's Republic of China and affiliated with the Communist Party of China. Critics have accused CGTN of broadcasting misinformation and making false allegations against opponents of the Chinese government. The network has been investigated by Ofcom, that's Britain's television regulator, for allegations of biased coverage and the airing of forced confessions, and has been characterized as a vehicle for government propaganda and disinformation campaigns by Reporters Without Borders and other sources. 2 years ago, CGTN was ordered by the U.S. Justice Department to register as a foreign agent. Let's talk about Neil Ferguson and his black box. I can just never get enough of it because this story just gets better and better and better. This is from Fox News. Imperial College model Britain used to justify lockdown, a buggy mess, totally unreliable, experts claim. The criticisms follow a series of policy turnabouts, including Prime Minister Boris Johnson's decision to extend the national lockdown. The United States also used the model, which predicted upwards of 2.2 million deaths in the U.S. without proper action. The prediction helped influence the White House to adopt a more serious approach to the pandemic. Yes, running around like your hair is on fire. That's the serious approach. Experts have derided the coding from Professor Neil Ferguson, warning that it is a buggy mess that looks more like a bowl of angel hair pasta than a finely tuned piece of programming. In our commercial reality, we would fire anyone for developing code like this, and any business that relied on it to produce software for sale would likely go bust. David Richards, co-founder of British data technology company WANdisco, told the Daily Telegraph. The imperial model works by using code to simulate transport links, population size, social networks, and healthcare provisions to predict how coronavirus would spread. Researchers released the code behind it, which developers have criticized as being unreadable. That is not exactly true. Ferguson always refused to release his code. What has been released is the code as it appears now, after a small army, presumably, of Microsoft coders have spent weeks attempting to tart it up. Scientists from the University of Edinburgh have further claimed that it is impossible to reproduce the same results from the same data using the model. The team got different results when they used different machines and even different results from the same machines. There appears to be a bug in either the creation or reuse of the network file if we attempt 2 completely identical runs, only varying in that the second should use the network file produced by the first. The results are quite different, the Edinburgh researchers wrote on the GitHub file. A fix was provided, but it was the first of many bugs found within the program. Models must be capable of passing the basic scientific test of producing the same results, given the same initial set of parameters. Otherwise, there is simply no way of knowing whether they will be reliable, said Michael Bonsall, professor of mathematical biology at Oxford University. A spokesperson for the Imperial College COVID-19 response team said, quote, "The UK government has never relied on a single disease model to inform decision-making. As has been repeatedly stated, decision-making around lockdown was based on a consensus view of the scientific evidence, including several modeling studies by different academic groups. Epidemiology is not a branch of computer science, and the conclusions around lockdown rely not on any mathematical model, but on the scientific consensus that COVID-19 is a highly transmissible virus with an infection fatality ratio exceeding 0.5% in the UK. This is what in England they call telling porky pies, that is to say, lies, because the British government did rely exclusively on Neil Ferguson's garbage model, his black box. Yes, and everyone is piling on Neil Ferguson, and he certainly deserves it. Yes, it's 13 years old, and it is written, the black box, and it's written in thousands of lines of undocumented C code. And of course, Neil Ferguson is not a programmer. Well, I mean, he's an amateur programmer. His model was not peer-reviewed, which isn't science supposed to be peer-reviewed? Researchers from Imperial College warned 510,000 Britons could die from the virus if no action was taken. Had the government stuck with their strategy of trying to mitigate the spread, allowing it to continue, but attempting to slow it down with limited measures such as home isolation for those with symptoms, the number would be roughly halved to 260,000. Yeah. Well, it's a curious situation we live in, where the media in the United States, in Britain, Canada, elsewhere in the world appears to be standing for COVID-19. Go, COVID-19, go. Get those numbers up. Because it'd be terribly embarrassing to Boris Johnson and to Donald Trump. Let's see, Dr. Konstantin Budnik, the VP of Architecture at WANDisco, told The Telegraph the facts from the early 2000s are just another confirmation that their modeling approach was flawed to the core. Let's see, yes, Professor Ferguson predicted in the early 2000s that up to 136,000 people could die from mad cow disease. The Imperial College team's modeling led to the culling of 6 million livestock and was later criticized by epidemiological experts as severely flawed and a tragedy for rural Britain's economy. The team also predicted 200 million could die from bird flu and another 65,000 from swine flu. The final death toll in each case was in the hundreds. Professor Ferguson defended Imperial's foot and mouth work, saying they were doing modeling in real time with limited data. He added, "I think the broad conclusions reached were still valid." Yes, he was just wrong by several orders of magnitude, but in the same ballpark, apparently. And you get this modeling in real time with limited data. It was a very old slogan or maxim in the industry, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. If you have limited data, very limited data, perhaps you shouldn't be modeling at all. Paul Joseph Watson writes in Summit News, psychotherapist Dr. Hugh Wilborn says lockdown zealots are displaying all the classic signs of cult members by doubling down on their beliefs despite having been proven wrong. In an article on his website, Wilborn highlights the work of respected social psychologist Leon Festinger, who analyzed the beliefs of a UFO cult in the 1950s who believed that a flying saucer would rescue them from the apocalypse. However, after the catastrophic earthquakes and floods they expected to hit the United States never arrived, and their beliefs were totally disproved, the cult members would become not less but more convinced of their beliefs. Festinger identified 5 conditions that needed to be met in order for the cult members to double down on their beliefs and avoid cognitive dissonance. 1, there must be conviction. 2, there must be commitment to this conviction. 3, the conviction must be amenable to unequivocal disconfirmation. 4, such unequivocal disconfirmation must occur. And 5, social support must be available subsequent to this disconfirmation. You remember after it was discovered that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, a number of the cheerleaders for the invasion of occupation of Iraq, they continued to claim that there were, in fact, weapons of mass destruction there. And, well, I mean, Saddam could have got them at some time. I mean, we know what an evil man he was. So the war was sold to us on the basis of weapons of mass destruction. They were not there, but it turned out this made no difference. Wilburn writes, Festinger's 5 conditions and the behavior of the cult believers correspond closely to the situation with Brexit, climate change, and COVID-19. A prophecy is made, believers invest themselves, their time, money, and prestige in it. The prophecy fails, and the believers become more fervent. The doctor notes how terrifying predictions of how many people COVID-19 would kill have fallen massively short, and the models that produce these numbers have been thoroughly debunked. Despite warnings that coronavirus would kill over 500,000 in the UK alone, the disease has only claimed 318,000 worldwide. To put this figure into perspective, the number of people who have died of or with COVID-19 in about 4.5 months is the same as the number who die in 5 days from cardiovascular disease, Wilburn writes. The doctor notes how experts are still doubling down anyway, warning of mass death if lockdown is lifted too early and a second wave of infections. In reality, research suggests that lockdowns had a minimal impact on infection numbers, and Sweden's per capita death toll is lower than the UK's and numerous other countries, despite the Scandinavian country having imposed no hard lockdown. Don't expect an apology from our government or any other government anytime soon, Wilburn writes. The Festinger effect is far, far more prevalent than a clear-sighted view of reality, and the tragedy is all the greater. Toby Young commented, is this starting to sound familiar? As Wilburn points out, the sequence that Festinger wrote about more than 50 years ago is eerily reminiscent of what's happening today. An apocalyptic prophecy was delivered from on high, the science. Those who believed it radically altered their behavior. The prophecy turned out not to be true, but instead of abandoning their doom-mongering, the believers have become even more fervent, attacking anyone who points out the gap between fantasy and reality as dangerous heretics, fake news, misinformation, conspiracy theories, etc. The difference, of course, is that Festinger's UFO cult had a few dozen members, whereas the COVID cult seems to have infected half the world. If Festinger's right, the bad news is we won't be able to persuade people to stop social distancing if we prove that the danger posed by COVID-19 has been dramatically overstated. On the contrary, people's opposition to returning to normal will intensify rather than diminish as the evidence mounts. They were wrong. Meanwhile, Karens all over the world don't show any signs of giving up on something that legitimizes their favorite thing in the world, lecturing other people about the behavior. I wonder to what extent this is connected to Trump derangement syndrome. On the night of Trump's election in 2016, we saw something rather amazing. We saw a collective nervous breakdown amongst millions of people in the United States. And this collective nervous breakdown has shown no signs of abating, to the point that a great many of these people, as I say, are standing, as the kids like to say, for COVID-19, that, yes, they want the country burned down in order to burn Trump. And I'm wondering if the COVID-19 panic, the sanitary dictatorship, is a sort of displaced reaction to Trump derangement syndrome. Someone I'd never heard of before, her name is Libby Watson. Libby, huh? She writes politics for the New Republic and tells us on Twitter, "I'm British, mate." Well, I'm not your mate, okay? And she has a piece in the New Republic, a little thing on why the lockdown protesters think they have a constitutional right to go to Arby's. You see how this has to be trivialized? The progressives have become totalitarians. You can't leave your house. You can't go to church, etc., etc., etc. Oh, yeah, these people are stupid because they're Trump supporters and they're stupid. But the people who took their AR-15s to Subway, citing their God-given freedoms as Americans, are not talking about their actual constitutional rights. Oh, they're talking about their unique understanding of the mythical promise of this nation, which is a place where a man can drive a big-ass truck, boo, trucks, drink a 74-ounce Slurpee, and go into the air-conditioned mall to purchase stuff. Well, I don't know. I think if I went through her tweets, I would find a devotion to all manner of consumerism. Because this is America, and if that's what America is, that's what the Constitution must necessarily be protecting. Children are educated in our schools, that the Constitution defends the American way of life. It's not that surprising if the end result of this is that people think that this is actually true. Yeah, the Constitution, what is it? What is it there for? I don't know. Libby's not really making this clear. In this case, they rage at being prevented from living their normal lives, going to Bed Bath and Beyond. Boo! Drinking margaritas at Chili's with friends. That's just terrible. What sort of wicked people would drink margaritas at Chili's with friends? Golfing, because they consider the conduct of their normal lives to be inseparable from the purpose of America. Yeah, and what's wrong with that? The right of essential workers not to die of coronavirus does not seem to enter the equation. How about the right of pedestrians not to be knocked over and killed by cars? How about the right of drivers not to be killed by other drivers' stupidity? I was watching this supercut of American traffic accidents earlier today, and I saw some pretty shocking behavior. It's just, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how prevalent this kind of behavior it is, but I imagine that a lot of people who saw this video would decide not to go on the highway for quite some time, perhaps if ever again, because there are a lot of careless people out there. But on the other hand, people don't seem to be all that frightened about driving automobiles, which kill you just like a COVID-19 does. This was a heartwarming story from the New York Post 2 days ago by John Levine. YouTube censors epidemiologist Knut Witkowski for opposing lockdown. Big tech companies are aggressively tamping down on COVID-19 misinformation, opinions and ideas contrary to official pronouncements. Dr. Knut Witkowski, former head of biostatistics, epidemiology, and research design at Rockefeller University, says YouTube removed a video of him talking about the virus that had racked up more than 1.3 million views. Witkowski, 65, is a ferocious critic of the nation's current steps to fight the coronavirus. He has derided social distancing, saying it only prolongs the virus's existence, and has attacked the current lockdown as mostly unnecessary. Witkowski, who holds 2 doctorates in computer science and medical biometry, believes the coronavirus should be allowed to create herd immunity, and that short of a vaccine, the pandemic will only end after it is sufficiently spread through the population. Quote, with all respiratory diseases, the only thing that stops the disease is herd immunity. About 80% of the people need to have had contact with the virus, and the majority of them won't even have recognized that they were infected, he says in the now deleted video. I was just explaining what we had, Witkowski told the Post, saying he had no idea why it was removed. The footage was produced by the British film company Journeyman Pictures. They don't tell you. They just say it violates our community standards. There's no explanation for what those standards are or what standards it violated. Here you have a top expert, and he is saying something, but apparently we're not supposed to listen to him because he's the wrong kind of expert. Apparently, the way that science works now is that political decisions are made, and that's the science. There's no disagreeing with political decisions. The dispute here is not about the nature of coronavirus. It's not about how it is transmitted, how it attacks the human body. The dispute here is about political policy. It's not about medicine. It's not about science. Anything that goes against World Health Organization recommendations would be a violation of our policy, and so removal is another really important part of that strategy, CEO Susan Wojcicki told CNN. Witkowski's argument is a minority opinion among his colleagues, but still well within mainstream thought, and currently is the basis for Sweden's non-lockdown approach to the pandemic. The embattled WHO, however, is not a fan, with the group's executive director of health emergencies, Mike Ryan, this week calling it a really dangerous calculation. Rockefeller University, Witkowski's employer for 20 years, also released a statement sharply distancing itself from him last month. While the doctor might have been too hot for YouTube, he has found a home at the American Institute for Economic Research, which is currently hosting the video online. Across social media, censors have been racing to limit the flow of verboten information. Facebook has said that it is working with state governments in California, New Jersey, and Nebraska to remove pages for anti-quarantine events. Protests, gatherings in public to express opinion. No, apparently this is a medical issue now. It's the kind of totalitarian thinking and conduct that has cost millions of lives in recent world history. The fact that it's being done by private companies and not government doesn't change that. Ron Coleman, a prominent First Amendment lawyer, told the Post. Witkowski, however, says history has already vindicated his earlier position that the old and immunocompromised alone should have been strictly isolated, which the Post reported in March. Roughly 1/3 of all U.S. COVID-19 deaths have been among nursing home patients and staff, a problem that Witkowski says was deeply exacerbated in New York by Governor Andrew Cuomo's March 25th executive order requiring nursing homes to accept individuals with the virus. I think they may be a little low on those numbers. In my country of Canada, as of last week, 82% of all the people who died were in nursing or long-term care facilities. I like the way that this ends. The German national flouts New York's coronavirus restrictions, walking around his Upper East Side neighborhood maskless and eating in underground restaurants. We don't have to fear anything but fear, he said. Wasn't that an American who said that? Indeed it was. Indeed it was. William Briggs' latest piece points out the obvious, but the obvious is now a rare commodity. The burden of proof that lockdowns work is clearly on those imposing and supporting lockdowns. Lockdown skeptics are under no obligation whatsoever to show lockdowns do not work. Lockdowns are a burden and imposition of severe restriction of liberty. It is certain and indisputable that they cause harm. Therefore, if lockdown supporters cannot prove with something approaching certainty that they work, then lockdowns cannot and should not be imposed. Lockdown supporters know, as we all know, that lockdowns will and have thrown people out of work, will and have swollen welfare rolls, caused recessions or worse, led to suicides, delayed and needed medical treatments, even caused death. Police have been ticketing and citing people for the crimes of playing soccer and sitting in parks. In Michigan, the governor decreed that people could not travel between their homes. Governments instituted lockdowns in an arbitrary and capricious manner, and they've given no indication what objective verifiable criteria will be used to lift them. In truth, the criteria will be the same as those used to institute them. When politicians think they will no longer be blamed for the virus causing deaths, fear drives the crisis in our leaders just as it does in citizens. That's why when I showed a graph below, I said we cannot conclude from it that lockdowns work. It may be, as some critics are saying, that I cannot prove lockdowns don't work from this graph. I do not have to. I have no such obligation. Others say that this graph doesn't account for population density, as if no lockdown Tokyo, Taipei, and Rio aren't dense. or obesity, age, sex, smoking status, weather, lockdown timing and severity, and anything else. Well, I said as much. I said that the only way to tell that lockdowns work was to gather all possible data on cause, including lockdown status, its timing, severity, compliance at the individual level from those that died, and from a good sample of those that didn't. See just what exactly killed and what did not kill. This is not impossible, but it hasn't happened and almost certainly won't, not worldwide. Oh, we'll see lots of BS stat studies with wee p-values aplenty, but none of it, I predict, will reach the level of proof. The only claim I make is that it is certain is that you cannot conclude from this data that lockdowns worked. Now, essentially what we're dealing with here is a tautology. Another criticism from a PhD professor at a big place said the data can't be trusted, not everywhere. Too true. I pointed out to him that you can't move from I have bad data to I know lockdowns work based on data. He disappeared. Another soy-faced PhD economist said the analysis disgusted him. Then he blocked me on Twitter, presumably to prevent further dyspepsia. Another bad argument is that a majority agreed and still agreed to willingly have their movements restricted. This is absurd because they could have been locked into they could have locked their own selves down and let the minority who wanted to remain at liberty be free. But no, the majority agreed to remove everyone's liberty in the belief that they themselves would be protected. Fear rules. That the majority agree does not make the elimination of liberty good or legal. Might in arms or through show of hands does not make right, though many living in democracies are accustomed to thinking it does, since so much is put to a vote. To say that a majority makes something good or evil is an obvious fallacy. The usual argument in favor of lockdowns runs like this. We know lockdowns work because lockdowns work, which is why we lock down, because if we didn't lock down, it would have been worse. It's science. You have a similar argument with regard to immigration, diversity, and multiculturalism. They work. Well, how do we know they work? Why do we have these things? Because they work. Yeah, but how do we know that they work? Well, we have them, don't they? Yeah, we have them. QED. That's the level of reasoning one gets from the media and the elite and even academics today. A better response is to say lockdowns force people inside and lessen their contact with others, therefore limiting the spread of the virus. This is countered by lockdowns force healthy and sick into tight quarters, therefore enhancing the spread of the virus. This is true too, at least in the US, because the form of the lockdowns were to throw people younger and healthier on average in small businesses out of work and force them to stay home, sometimes with older relatives who are, of course, older and unhealthier on average. It also allowed people out for limited terms to shop for groceries and the like, and then force them back inside. Stores owned by oligarchs were allowed to remain open. This implies the virus, as many joked, could tell the difference between Costco, which wasn't locked down, and say a small jeweler's, which was forced to close. The virus didn't dare infect Costco shoppers, but those searching for wedding rings would have dropped dead on the spot. The answer to the jewelry stores is to say any limitation of human contact short of causing people to starve helped in limiting spread of the virus. This is another way of saying lockdowns work because lockdowns work. It's far from clear allowing essential businesses to remain open and the forced clothing and or other disruptions of inessential businesses made any difference whatsoever to the spread of the virus. Andrew Cuomo, who we'll be getting to shortly because I think he's in big trouble. Andrew Cuomo, in full pander mode, infamously said in March that if his dictatorial orders save just one life, then it will be worth it. This is false, since the lockdowns caused at least some deaths, with some evidence pointing to many deaths. Death, in any case, is only one metric. It cannot be the only one, or else we would ban driving. The whole of the cost of the lockdown must be compared with the demonstrated and not just asserted benefit. Matt Taibbi, who writes for Rolling Stone magazine, I suppose you could call him a leftist of the old sort. He is not very happy with the media, his profession. He authored a piece a few days ago And he talked about Judge Emmett Sullivan is refusing to let William Barr's Justice Department drop the charge against Michael Flynn. He's even thinking of adding more, appointing a retired judge to ask whether the court should issue an order to show cause why Flynn should not be held in criminal contempt for perjury. Pundits are cheering. A trio of former law enforcement and judicial officials saluted Sullivan in the Washington Post, chirping, "The Flynn case isn't over until a judge says it's over." Yuppie icon Jeffrey Toobin of CNN and The New Yorker, one of La Résistance crowd's favored legal authorities, described Sullivan's appointment of Judge John Gleeson as brilliant. MSNBC legal analyst Glenn Kirshner said Americans owe Sullivan a debt of gratitude. One had to search far and wide to find a non-conservative legal analyst willing to say the obvious, i.e., that Sullivan's decision was the kind of thing one would expect from a judge in Belarus. George Washington University professor Jonathan Turley was one of the few willing to say Sullivan's move could create a threat of judicial charge even when prosecutors agree with defendants. Sullivan's reaction was amplified by a group letter calling for Barr's resignation, signed by 2,000 former Justice Department officials. The melodramatic group email somberly reported as momentous news as one of the many tired media tropes of the Trump era. And the preposterous leak of news that the drop case made Barack Obama sad. The former president privately told members of his administration, who instantly told Yahoo News, that there was no precedent for the dropping of perjury charges and that the rule of law was at stake. Whatever one's opinion of Flynn, his relations with Turkey, his lock-her-up chance, his haircut, or anything, this case was never about much. There's no longer any pretense that prosecution would lead to the unspooling of a massive Trump-Russia conspiracy, as pundits once breathlessly expected. In fact, news that Flynn was cooperating with special counsel Robert Mueller inspired many of the "is this the beginning of the end for Trump" stories that will someday fill whole chapters of Journalism Fucks Up 101 textbooks. And then he talks about all of the abuses. With regard to Flynn, we were told that his plea, his initial guilty plea, was just the tip of the iceberg that would take the trail of Russian collusion to the center of the plot, i.e. Trump. It turned out he had no deeper story to tell. In fact, none of the people prosecutors tossed in jail to get at the Russia plot, some little more than bystanders, had anything to share. Remember George Papadopoulos, whose alleged conversation about dirt on Hillary Clinton with an Australian diplomat created the pretext for the FBI's entire Trump-Russia investigation? We just found out in newly released testimony by Andrew McCabe that the FBI felt as early as the summer of 2016 that the evidence, quote, didn't particularly indicate, unquote, that Papadopoulos was, quote, interacting with the Russians, unquote. After Edward Snowden's 2013 revelations about mass data collection, a series of internal investigations began showing officials were breaking rules against spying on specific Americans via the NSA program. Searches were conducted too often and without proper justification, and the results were shared with too many people, including private contractors. By October 2016, the FISA court was declaring that systematic overuse of so-called 702 searches was a very serious Fourth Amendment issue. In later court documents, it came out that the FBI conducted 3.1 million such queries in 2017 alone. I can understand not caring about the plight of Michael Flynn, but cases like this have turned erstwhile liberals, people who just a decade ago were marching in the streets over the civil liberties implications of Cheney's war on terror apparatus, into defenders of the spy state. Politicians and pundits across the last 4 years have rolled their eyes at attorney-client privilege, the presumption of innocence, the right to face one's accuser, the right to counsel, and a host of other issues, regularly denouncing civil rights worries as red herring excuses for Trumpism. Republicans throughout this time were usually as bad or worse on these issues, but Democrats have lately positioned themselves as more aggressive promoters of strong-arm policies, from control of internet speech to the embrace of domestic spying. Democrats clearly believe constituents will forgive them for abandoning constitutional principles so long as the targets of official inquiry are figures like Flynn or Paul Manafort or Trump himself. Yes, the Constitution Oh, yes, you mean your supposed right to go to Arby's? Well, apparently the Constitution is just a red herring, or certainly a dead letter. I mean, people's lives are at stake. Now, we heard from many Republicans about this surveillance that, if it saves just one life, because apparently there's all of these people with suitcase bombs out there. It's never been demonstrated to me that such a thing as a suitcase bomb would even be possible. You remember how we were told that people were going to mix two different kinds of liquids on planes and blow them up? Shoe bombers and all this nonsense. There's no evidence of any of that stuff either. But we all got used to being treated as dangerous criminals when we went to the airport. And so kudos to Matt Taibbi. Alex Berenson has become a famous person. And if you go to his Twitter account, you will find people ranting hysterically at him. Essentially, he's a murderer because he's a lockdown skeptic. He had a tweet storm the other day. I thought a bit about why the media blue checks hate me so, and let's be honest, they do hate me so. I'm nobody really. I don't have a primetime news show, a syndicated column. I have all of 103,000 followers on Twitter, but I am particular burr for 3 reasons. I'm a class traitor, not just because I worked for the New York Times for 10 years and wrote lots of hardball pieces about companies, not to mention our failures in Iraq, that make me tough to dismiss as a right-wing nutter, much as they'd like to try. No, I'm a class traitor in another arguably more important way, too. The media academic left tries to cudgel its opponents with an attitude of mocking scorn and intellectual superiority. The president has been a useful foil for them in this, as they have been for them. But that game doesn't work with me. I'm as credentialed as the people shouting at me, only I follow the facts where they go. This is why these people hated Tell Your Children so much. One can know cannabis has serious mental health risks and still want it legalized, but the blue checks have been telling each other the same nonsense for so long they genuinely didn't understand that cannabis was dangerous. They're still trying to figure out what to do with that news, and they can't stand knowing it. So yelling at me to shut up doesn't work, and trying to bait me into arguments doesn't work, and telling me my tone is wrong doesn't work, even when it is. I keep on merrily presenting studies and facts, and even if the media won't pay attention, other people will. And the email I get, which is overwhelming and overwhelmingly in favor of my effort, suggests many, many people, some fancy, some not, are sick of feeling mocked and told they're stupid for their sincere beliefs about the dangers of the lockdowns. The second reason is I think that it's clear by now that my wife and I practice what we preach. We don't fear COVID, not for ourselves or our kids. So accusing us of being hypocrites won't fly. And for those folks calling me a grifter, I've been doing this for free for the last 2 months with one minor exception. Hillsdale College paid me to make a video about the failure of the models. Maybe I'll write a book one day, maybe not, but financially this has been nothing but a distraction. The third reason is the most obvious. The hysterics have been wrong. They know it whether they admit it or not. Except for the most at-risk populations who should be the focus of our protective efforts, COVID looks to be a minor risk. And with every day that goes by, every state and country that reopen without catastrophe, the lockdowns appear more insane. We should all be thrilled about this fact, but too many of us aren't. So the media and the lockdown governors are stretching further and further to try to scare people, the recent pediatric stuff being only the grossest example. I'm going to keep calling them out. Plenty of other people will too, but not necessarily as aggressively. And now we come back to tone. Well, I'll be honest. As far as I'm concerned, I bite my tongue a lot of the time. If these blue checks knew what I really thought of them or the damage they have done and are still doing by refusing to accept the data and facts and science, they would hate me even more. Here's a story from John Lott in Town Hall. We've been talking about data, okay? And let's say the difficulty or the irresponsibility of basing public policy on crummy data done in modeling done in real time. Perhaps we can learn that lesson, not to do that anymore. Let's see. This article was done with a doctor and a lawyer, Timothy Craig Allen. Over 86,500 people have reportedly died in the U.S. from the coronavirus, and the fear generated by those deaths is driving the public policy debate. But that number is a dramatic overcount. Our metrics include deaths that have nothing to do with the virus. The problem is even worse, as the Centers for Disease Control overcounts even some of these cases, and the government has created financial incentives for this misreporting. Relying on these flawed numbers is destroying businesses and jobs and costing lives. The case definition is very simplistic. Dr. Ngozi Ezeka, the director of Illinois Department of Public Health, explains. It means at the time of death, it was a COVID-positive diagnosis. That means that if you were in hospice and already had been given a few weeks to live, and you were also found to have COVID, that would be counted as a COVID death. It means technically, even if you died of a clear alternative case, but you had COVID at the same time, it's still listed as a COVID death. Medical examiners in Michigan use the same definition. In Macomb and Oakland counties, where most of the deaths occurred, medical examiners classify any deaths as coronavirus deaths when the postmortem test is positive. Even people who died in suicides and automobile accidents meet that definition. Still, these broad definitions are not due to a few rogue public health officials. The rules direct them to do this. Unlike other countries, if someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death, as Dr. Deborah Birx, the White House Coronavirus Response Coordinator, recently noted. Classifications go beyond even these broad categories. New York is classifying cases as coronavirus deaths, even when postmortem tests have been negative. Despite negative test classifications are based on symptoms, even though symptoms are often very similar to those of the seasonal flu. The CDC guidance explicitly acknowledges the uncertainty that doctors can face. When coronavirus cases are suspected, they advise doctors it is acceptable to report COVID-19 on a death certificate. This isn't just a theoretical issue. On April 21st, when New York City's death toll rose above 10,000, the New York Times reported that the city included 3,700 additional people who were presumed to have died of the coronavirus but had never tested positive, a more than 50% increase in the number of cases. But the problem is worse than this broad definition implies. Birx and others believe that the CDC is overcounting cases. The Washington Post reports that they're concerned that the CDC's antiquated accounting system is double counting cases and inflating mortality and case counts by as much as 25%. There are additional reasons for concern. Some doctors feel pressure from hospitals to list deaths as due to the coronavirus, even when they don't believe that is the case, to make it look a little bit worse than it is. There are financial incentives that might make a difference for hospitals and doctors. The CARES Act as a 20% premium for COVID-19 Medicare patients. Now, some of you might be thinking a physician, a public health professional, would never deliberately exaggerate the virulence of a disease in order to make some sort of point or to throw their weight around. Well, you might recall that last week I quoted an article praising to the skies the chief medical officer of an Australian state, I believe it was Queensland, who said that no, that COVID-19 is of little threat to school children, but I closed the schools deliberately in order to make the point of just how serious this is, such that people would pay attention. Lott continues. The Washington Post and others claim that we are undercounting the true number of deaths. They reach that conclusion by showing the total number of deaths from all causes is greater than we would normally expect from March through early May, and that this excess is actually due to deaths not being accurately labeled as due to the coronavirus. But these are simply not normal times. Lots of people with heart and other problems are not going to the hospital for fear of the virus. Surgeries for many serious conditions are being put off. The stress of the situation is increasing suicides and other illnesses. It is hard to believe that we are basing such crucial decisions on such flawed data, Lott concludes. Greg Abbott, who is the governor of Texas, he had a tweet today, or yesterday rather, which is going to be infuriating to a lot of people. 4 most populous states by the numbers, and those are California, Texas, Florida, and New York. Let's look at their populations. 40 million in California, 29.5 in Texas, 22 in Florida, and 19.5 in New York. Oh, I see California has a state income tax of 13%, and New York has a state income tax of 8%. Texas and Florida have no state income tax. Let's look at their financial situation. Texas and Florida have balanced budgets. California has 54 billion in debt. New York State, 6.1 billion in debt. COVID-19 cases. California, 69,382. Texas, slightly over 41,000. Florida, almost 42,000. New York State, 336,681. COVID-19 deaths. 2,847 in California, 1,133 in Texas, 1,779 in Florida, and 27,282 in the state of New York. So the mortality rate in California, 0.0071. In Texas, 0.0038. In Florida, 0.0081. But in New York, 0.1399. Dining in restaurants, salon barbers, are they open? Churches, gyms? The first three, in Texas and Florida, gyms are still closed. All of these things are closed in California and New York. The mayor of Atlanta, what's her name? Keisha Lance Bottoms or Bottom Lance or something like that. She admitted today that the opening up of Georgia apparently was supposed to cause a catastrophe, but it has not. And she proclaimed she was somewhat surprised at this. Make no mistake, this is a blue versus red, left versus right, Democrat versus Republican issue. It's from Politico. Democratic governors hit with a flurry of legal challenges to coronavirus lockdowns. And it's illustrated with a picture of Michigan's Governor Karen, Governor Botox. Let's see, lockdown skeptics got a big boost this week. The decision by Wisconsin's Supreme Court on Wednesday to toss Governor Tony Evers' statewide shelter-in-place order set off a scramble in cities across the state to impose their own local restrictions. Elsewhere, bars and restaurants shut down by the order declared themselves open for business, and legal challenges are continuing to pile up across the country, even as governors who extend their state shelter-in-place orders begin peeling back some restrictions. The plaintiffs are business owners, aggrieved private citizens, pastors, and in some cases, state legislators and legislatures. Their targets almost always Democratic governors or their top health appointees. In California, Governor Gavin Newsom is facing more than a dozen lawsuits challenging everything from beach to business closures. And earlier in May, a coalition of business owners sued Maine Governor Janet Mills, also a Democrat, seeking to end that state's shelter-in-place order. So it is a political issue. Oh, yes, Gavin Newsom. Never let a crisis go to waste, eh? This clown. This is according to Washington Times. This is, so much of what I've seen in the last few months makes me question my sanity. Let's go with this. Gavin Newsom is proposing to significantly shrink the footprint of California's prison system, partly because of massive budget cuts prompted by the pandemic, but also because of philosophy. The revised budget he sent to state lawmakers this week envisions closing 2 state prisons in the coming years, cutting nearly 1 in 5 of the 43 inmate firefighter camps, and eventually closing all 3 state-run juvenile prisons. He's also seeking unspecified increases to sentencing credits that allow inmates to leave prison more quickly, and he proposes to shorten parole to a maximum of 2 years, down from 5 years for felonies, and let ex-felons earn their way off supervision in just a year or 18 months for sex offenders. The Democratic governor called it a core value of his administration to eliminate prisons and invest more in education. It follows nearly a decade of prison reform in California, starting under Governor Jerry Brown, when the state began keeping less serious criminals in county jails as one way to cut spending during the Great Recession. Well, I guess if you make it not a crime anymore to steal up to what is it, $850, $900 worth of material. You can reduce crime very easily by simply stop defining certain acts as crimes. Now, the irony is so thick here that you could cut it with a knife, that the governor of California has essentially imprisoned the law-abiding people of the state of California, while deciding that the people who do not obey the law, including those convicted of felonies and sex offenses, are to be released from prison. It is true that America has a very high percentage of people in prison or on parole. How did this come about? Well, it was kind of a breakdown of society starting in the 1960s, and this went completely out of control during the crack epidemic. And then it was discovered that if you put more people in prison, then the streets became less hellish, more livable. But apparently, it's back to a free-for-all, back to road war in California. Maybe the people who want to go to the beach can, they can fight the felons and the rapists who've been released from prison. Oh, this is from the U.S. Sun. Bill de Blasio, who is the mayor of New York City, says anyone who tries to swim at a New York City beach will be taken right out of the water and fences may go up. I'm looking at a picture of what is presumably a New York City beach, and it is simply chock-a-block. No social distancing there. De Blasio issued the stark warning during his COVID-19 press briefing on Monday, saying the city was getting fencing ready while NYPD and the Parks Department would monitor the situation. Guess what other jurisdiction is looking to release as many prisoners as possible and to just pretty much waive the whole idea of bail? Why, that would be New York City, wouldn't it? Wouldn't it? State beaches in New York, Delaware, Connecticut, and New Jersey will reopen ahead of the Memorial Day weekend, but New York Governor Cuomo said local officials could keep beaches closed amid COVID-19 fears. De Blasio explained officials would not be putting up police barriers on New York beaches just yet to give people a chance to comply with the rules after a weekend of people flouting the guidelines. He reiterated that no swimming, no lifeguards, no parties, no barbecues, and no sports were allowed on the sand, where social distancing rules would still apply. It's a dangerous situation to ever go in the water if there are no lifeguards present, de Blasio noted, saying city officials wanted to avoid a situation where people took buses or subways to the beach. It's a dangerous situation to ever go into the water if there are no lifeguards present. Does that mean like the little kiddies who are, going up to their knees or maybe to their waist, or elderly people, kicking their shoes off and rolling up their pants and walking along the edge of the beach so that the water can cool their feet? Wow, I had no idea that was so dangerous, but I suppose someone's going to tell me that dangerous riptides kill 100,000 Americans every year, something like that. Sharks, perhaps. I don't know how a lifeguard could save you from a shark. But there we have it. Yeah, let's get back to Governor Death here. This is again from the New York Post. New York Congresswoman Elise Stefanik is demanding a federal probe of Governor Cuomo's handling of COVID-19 in nursing homes. Her call came after a new report showed the state quietly altered the way it publicly reports nursing home deaths from the virus. In early May, the state stopped counting nursing home patients who died from COVID in hospitals in its official tallies of nursing home fatalities, the Daily Caller reported. It now only includes those deaths that occur in the nursing home facility itself. Cuomo is taking heat for vulnerable nursing home populations ravaged by coronavirus, with a state death toll of at least 5,300, and that's with the state's new counting method that ignores outside facility deaths. Today, I joined my New York GOP colleagues in the House to call for a federal investigation of Cuomo's failed nursing home policies. Now they admit They unethically changed the way they report nursing home deaths, and an inexcusable tragedy for New York. Need answers, Stefanik, an upstate Republican, said in a tweet. Cuomo's March 25th executive order forced state nursing homes and assisted living facilities, many ill-equipped to stop the spread of the disease, to accept residents with COVID-19. The decision proved to have fatal consequences, with a third of all coronavirus deaths in the state occurring in nursing homes. Florida, which issued an order around the same time keeping COVID-19 patients out of nursing homes, has seen 1/7 of the nursing home deaths New York has suffered. Stefanik joins a growing list of New York lawmakers demanding a probe of Cuomo's pandemic policies. Former Governor Pataki and Staten Island State Assemblywoman Nicole Maliotakis have also called for an investigation. On March 24th, Governor Cuomo said, "My mother is not expendable, your mother is not expendable." And yet the very next day, he signed an executive order mandating nursing homes where our most vulnerable mothers and our most vulnerable fathers reside to accept COVID-positive patients. I've heard a rumor, I can't confirm this, that these governors are looking for some sort of indemnification, perhaps from the federal government, that they won't be held personally responsible, presumably in civil law, as well as in criminal law, for the consequences of their monstrous actions. Let's go back to the chat, see what is happening there. Don from Beyond says, "For God's sake, study what the word quarantine is supposed to mean. I said here at the very beginning, the immunocompromised, elderly, etc. are supposed to be quarantined, not the masses of people." Donald Robertson says, "Once we get a handle on crime control, liberals want to undo all of the gains that were made, even though being a victim of crime was a greater risk back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. Well, you see, there's the question of disparate impact. America was made safer. America's streets were made safer largely by putting blacks and Hispanics in prison. There's no getting around it. The disparate impact, people say, well, this is prima facie proof of racism. Now, it's difficult to argue against, because if you're going to argue against it, you're going to say, no, it's not prima facie evidence of racism. It is evidence of, how should we say, different types of behaviors among different groups of people. And that is a very controversial statement. Now, let's see. De Blasio and Cuomo must have a circle in hell, says Chogokin 666. You know, Bill de Blasio, I don't follow New York City politics that closely. How is it a man so obviously stupid got elected mayor of New York? I mean, it's a mystery. It's a mystery to me. The comedic truth says KMG wants to pardon them. He works for them. Who would that be? I don't understand that. Manfred von Thistlebaum, in the understatement of the day, says New York has not handled the virus well. No, and of course the media decided to lionize Andrew Cuomo, and it's going to be interesting to see whether they climb down from that, because we're looking at what, trillions of dollars in lawsuits here, and perhaps attempts at criminal charges for manslaughter and the like. British American says, then again, Trump seems exceedingly robust, knock on wood, positively Churchillian. Churchill having been a drunk and a heavy overweight smoker who slept 4 hours a night and lived to 95 or so. There was a scandal, of course, in Britain. Churchill's second term as prime minister, he suffered a serious stroke and was pretty much gaga for the last year, which was kept from the public. Churchill's personal physician said something to the effect, I don't have the exact quotation in front of me, that there was not a single hour of the day in which Churchill did not have alcohol in his system. Trump, of course, doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. Trump seems to be somewhat overweight. Chogokin 666 says, beautiful day in New York City Sunday, marred by cop cars announcing not to have too much fun. Not even lying. How many people would a virus have to kill in order for you to get on board with the lockdown? This is Tom Anderson. Well, as William Briggs pointed out, there's no proof that lockdowns work. If you're talking about real quarantine, if you're talking everyone being boarded up and the military delivering food, that would be one thing. But as I've mentioned before, we're allowing people to go to grocery stores. There is no way that this absurd 6 feet or 2 meter social distancing can be enforced in grocery stores, and it is not enforced. You are forced to pass very closely. And again, people don't seem to be all of that worried about it. Not the people that I see in the grocery stores. Don from Beyond says a few thousand people can take down the stupid fences easily. What are they going to do? Shoot people? Yeah, I don't know. Metal Mike says Rockaway Beach is closed. The Ramones are dead. That was a very, very catchy song. I never quite understood why it didn't become a hit single. Jonathan Paul says we need chain gangs here in California. British American says I love Trump, and as such, I wish he would take care of his health a little better, especially diet and weight. He should lose about 20 to 30 pounds. He is too important. You know, it happens quite often. People lose a lot of weight too quickly, and they suffer dire health consequences as a result. Of course, people who lose weight quickly, they often have a tendency to put that weight back on just as quickly with a yo-yoing effect. That's not good for people. I suppose the difficulty that most people have is to do this gradually. You know, to lose a pound a week or 20 or 30 weeks without, without losing control of your diet. Chad Chadson, KMG leaves his hotel periodically to enjoy cigarettes. I took a 3-mile walk this morning, and I'm staying in James Bay, and I walked all the way downtown and then past downtown, specifically to the Save-On food store at Vancouver and Pandora Street. And I would say that I saw on the streets, let's say 350 to 400 people. It's a holiday here today. Of those people, 3 were wearing masks. 3. And one of them was a woman, and she had it pulled down under her chin so she could speak on her cell phone, so I don't know what good the mask was doing. What that tells me that, one of two things. That people in Victoria are practically, they are not as terrified as we have been led to believe. But the second possibility is rather depressing, which is that the people that I saw on the streets were outliers. And the majority or vast majority of Victoria's population is locked inside, cowering in their homes. I mean, that could be true. I can't say. Don from Beyond, did the temp in Kevin's area rise above freezing? Well, last weekend it was 79 degrees, which is shockingly hot. It's been quite warm in my apartment. I don't know, it's disconcerting that I go outside at night and the air is cool and refreshing, and then I come back to my hotel room, and despite the fact that I've got the air conditioning on, that it is stultifying. Tom Anderson says, actually, the IFR is 1.4% in New York. That's quite high, yeah, especially if you overcount and you make what seems to be a deliberate decision to kill as many old people as possible. Okay, let's get back to it here and go back to Toby Young. Yes, the latest woes over the National Health Service's contact tracing app. It's difficult to have confidence in governments when they seem to find it very difficult to do what should be simple things without botching them. The Daily Mail leads with a classic vox pop by Harry Wallop in Southwold, a Suffolk coastal town, which is a cipher for small towns across the country. Harry has spoken to various shopkeepers in its once thriving, now deserted high street. That's what in England, they call roughly downtown. With all of the retailers, the grocery stores, the fashion shops, et cetera, electronics, that sort of thing. And to see how they're faring, the answers, well, unsurprising, are distressing. Many shops shut with turnover down, and those still open by up to 90%, and all of them facing huge bills for everything from rent to perspex screens. After this is over, we're going to have to live with these perspex screens. Remember getting papers to live in Britain in 1985, and going to the British consulate in Vancouver and being really shocked to see a thick panel of glass separating me from the clerk behind the glass. But now there is glass or plastic separating all of us from all of us. And I don't know, maybe it's like watching The Wire, Oh yeah, there's just slip this under there. We'll slip this through there. Don't want to get too close. Somebody might shoot me or, breathe on me. In Southwold, for all its independence, there are 12 empty stores with many closed shops and gift shops closing over the past year. Those surviving still have to pay rent to landlords, even during the lockdown. Many fear that when they are allowed to reopen, social distancing restrictions will be so severe it will be impossible to make enough money to pay their bills. If you walk from James Bay down Government Street towards downtown, what you get are tourist shops, because Victoria has two main industries, and the first one is government, and the second one is tourism. And these stores have been closed for months now. And of course, Victoria depends to a very large extent on tourists from the United States, and the border remains closed, and it seems to me entirely likely that 70, 89% of these tourist shops in Victoria are going to be closed permanently. And no regional variation allowed in Britain, despite the R rate varying widely in different parts of the UK. And this is a very feminine decision. The rules have to be the same for everyone. I see Toby Young has included the artwork from the Sex Pistols single, I believe it was the fourth, called Holidays in the Sun. The Times says that overseas holidays are likely to be banned this year, with Brits returning from foreign climes being forced into a 14-day self-quarantine, which will make leaving the country impractical and destroy much of what's left of the country's travel industry. This is quite funny here. Lorry, or truck drivers, are expected to be exempt from the rules, which does at least allow for the possibility of families from Milton Keynes being smuggled back into the country alongside those from Mogadishu and Mosul. I quite like that. In addition, the paper says scientists researching coronavirus may also be exempt. Does that include social scientists researching the impact of the virus on Italian and Spanish coastal towns? I studied economics at university. Online, the Times reports the comments of Ryanair Chief Executive Michael O'Leary on the Today program this morning that the 14-day quarantine policy is idiotic and unimplementable. O'Leary predicts any such plan will be dropped within weeks because people will refuse to abide by it. Wales Online says package holidays will cost at least twice as much post-pandemic. Time to invest in a holiday let in Cornwall. The Guardian reports that 6 million people fear losing their jobs. The survey finds 60% of workers are at most 3 months away from rent or mortgage default. Private schools or academy chains are backing the government's plan to reopen schools. But as I mentioned before, the teachers union appears to be adamant that no, it's too dangerous. The latest nonsense that I heard is that notebooks, children fill out notebooks, quizzes. Oh no, the teachers can't touch them. No, because the paper is going to be contaminated. Let's see, keeping schools closed to tackle the coronavirus pandemic is almost certain to increase educational inequalities between children from the richest and poorest families. One would think so. Yes. The Telegraph has a summary of a new report by Australia's National Centre for Immunisation Research and Surveillance, which concludes that the risk of coronavirus spreading in schools is extremely low. But, just close them anyway. The London Sun editorialized militant unions telling teachers they should refuse to go back must also urgently rethink their stance. Reopening schools is obviously essential if we are to prevent the poorest and most vulnerable children falling behind. New research reveals that better off children are spending a whopping 30% more time each day on education than those from poorer homes. And the Telegraph has a report on what it says are the first images to emerge of what life will be like for British children in primary schools. It turns out this is exactly, and I mean exactly, the same story that I ran on Lockdown Skeptics last week about the now deleted Facebook post complaining about the new rules in place at Holywell Village First School in Northumberland, where it's just an absolute nightmare. It's like students have long compared schools to prisons, but now they're really trying to make that a reality. Toby Young writes, people who dare to tell the truth about the government's massive overreaction to the pandemic and challenge the propaganda being pumped out daily to justify it are so often accused of spreading fake news and misinformation that I'm tempted to create a page on the right-hand side called Fake News, but with the word fake crossed out and replaced with the word real. In this regard, it's worth reading Omar Khan's Medium post about the hysterical coverage of the crisis in the New York Times and Washington Post. So we have snooker champion Peter Ebdon telling BBC 5 Live, is social distancing harmful? Yes, it probably is. People need to shake hands. They need to build up their immunity. There's an awful lot of brainwashing going on at the moment. We're facing the greatest psychological operation in history. All sounds pretty reasonable to me, but not to the Independent. The headline in today's paper reads, former snooker champion promotes coronavirus conspiracy theory. I wonder who else the Independent is going to accuse of promoting coronavirus conspiracy theories. The Royal College of Psychiatrists. On Saturday, it warned that psychiatrists are in danger of being overwhelmed by a tsunami of mental illness. By way of confirmation, the BBC reports that over 500,000 people have accessed online training courses that aim to prevent suicide in the last 3 weeks alone. Yeah, I mean, you would think that it would be fairly obvious when you tell people, oh, there's no more normal anymore, and all that human contact that you used to have, you can't have that anymore. And you're going to be accused of being a murderer, if you want to walk to the park or go to the beach, that this is going to have terrible effects on people's mental health. But, lockdowns work, and we know that lockdowns work because they work, because if they didn't work, we wouldn't have lockdowns. Let's see, 80,000 people in the UK died from what was known as the Hong Kong flu. As a percentage of the UK population back then, 55 million, this was 1968-70, that's the equivalent of 97,000 in today's money. And it was a big story at the time, but we didn't lock people up in their homes or mothball our economy, and as a result, there was no hit to GDP. Whole year growth for 1969 was 1.9%. For 1970, it was 2.7%. I should point out that was a time when Britain was in the midst of an appalling economic malaise. Up to a fifth of Britain's COVID-19 patients caught the virus while in hospital for another illness, health chiefs admit, as senior official says spread of illness within the NHS is concerning. You remember that slogan, protect the NHS? Well, perhaps the NHS should have been doing a better job to protect Britons. Because it is, Britons have been infected by hospital workers, by employees, old age homes. It's a similar situation in Canada, again, with the total as of last week, the absolutely shocking number that 82% of the COVID-19 deaths in Canada have been in nursing and long-term care facilities. I don't know. One jumps to the conclusion that our leaders are either irretrievably stupid or they've simply decided that very old people are expendable. Old people cost a lot of money. They cost a lot of money in living care. They cost a lot of money in medical care. They cost a lot of money in pensions. But I guess we're going to be spending rather a significant amount less than that, because all of the old people that we've managed to bump off. Dr. Aidan Fowler, Director of Patient Safety at NHS England, says he is concerned about the rates of nosocomial spread within our hospitals. Nosocomial infection is that which takes place inside a medical facility. He said that around 5,000 NHS staff with symptoms are being tested every day for COVID-19, but if efforts to track down and stop infection spread must increase. How many months has it been? And they're just realizing this problem, this catastrophe now? April was the quietest month ever for A&E departments across England. NHS statistics have revealed only 917,000 emergency department visits were recorded in the month that Britain's coronavirus crisis peaked. The first time on record, the number has dipped below 1 million. The number of times people sought emergency help fell by more than half in just 2 months as COVID-19 gripped the nation. People have been avoiding hospitals out of fear of adding extra pressure to the NHS or catching the virus while they're in the hospital, doctors say. The fact that it's dropped in half, and we see the very high numbers of people who are in Britain who've been infected while being in hospitals, tells us that hospitals are exceedingly dangerous places. Nigel Edwards says hospitals have only been able to carry out about 15 to 20% of elective procedures, meaning up to 1.3 million patients are missing out every month. And we are going to see a huge spike in deaths from this quite soon. Now, we're going to see that same huge spike all over the Western world. What else is going on in the world? China is very upset with us. I can't imagine why. Fears of global trade war with China after Beijing slaps 80% tariff on Australian exports starting today as brutal payback over countries' call for coronavirus inquiry backed by 100 nations, including the UK. Well, yeah, keep going. Keep it up, China. I think this is going to work out really, really well because China depends to an enormous extent on food exports from our countries to theirs. China cannot feed itself. So here's the deal. How about China stops selling its cheap tat to Australia, and Australia stops, sending beef and pork, vegetables and the like to China. Sound like a fair trade to you? Does to me. On Monday, the World Health Organization bowed to calls from most of its member states to launch an independent probe in how it managed the international response to coronavirus, which has been clouded by finger-pointing between the U.S. and China. EU spokeswoman Virginia Batu Henriksen said several key questions needed to be answered as part of a review. How did this pandemic spread? What is the epidemiology behind it? All this is absolutely crucial for us going forward to avoid another pandemic of this kind. Last month, Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab said China faces hard questions about the source of the coronavirus pandemic, adding there would have to be a deep dive into the facts around the outbreak. He also said it wouldn't go back to business as usual between the UK and China after the pandemic eases. The Prime Minister of Australia has demanded an independent probe into the virus and into the WHO's treatment of it. In response, Chinese state media and leaders warned of trade retribution that could wipe $135 billion from the Australian economy. After weeks of threatening to boycott the meat and barley industries, Keep in mind, China cannot feed itself. And restrict travel and foreign education opportunities. Oh dear. I mean, Australia is not going to be overrun by Chinese students any longer? That would be a shame. Beijing claims Australia subsidized its farmers and dumped barley in China. The tax will remain in place for 5 years. There are some people who are suggesting that China is so discombobulated by what has happened. And it's not just, that world leaders are pointing fingers at China. The polling tells us that the people do not hold China in good odor today. That the Chinese are going to be so upset about this that they're going to invade Taiwan. I suppose it could happen. So what's the situation here in Canada on this beautiful Victoria Day? Well, I mentioned my own experience on the streets. And let's look at the numbers. Confirmed cases in Canada, 78,000. Number of deaths, 5,842. Again, Canada has 38 million people. There seems to be a lull, in the battle between Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Manitoba is still stuck at 7, and Saskatchewan is still stuck at 6 deaths. Keep in mind, both of these provinces have more than 1 million inhabitants. British Columbia, which has a population of 5.1 million, has 2,444 cases and 143 deaths. 2,444 cases. That is not very many cases, I must say. Oh, yes. People who live in Canada and read the foreign media often get upset. There was a story, I guess it was in the Daily Mail, the Snowbirds, which is like the Canadian equivalent of the Blue Angels, that one of their planes crashed, and in Kamloops, British Columbia, which was described as a suburb of Vancouver. Kamloops is all the way on the other end of the province, and British Columbia is a very large place. It is something like 800 or 900 miles away. Vancouver's a bigger city than it was, but no, the suburbs don't extend that far. They do extend all the way up to the Whistler and all the way down to the U.S. border, and they do pretty much extend all the way to Chilliwack or Hope. Greater Vancouver has certainly metastasized in recent decades. Okay, so there are some things happening in Canada, some important things. There's a reporter for the Vancouver Sun. His name is Douglas Todd. He's been there for decades. He is one of the few, how would I say, interesting and intelligent reporters still left in my country. He tweeted, "Some may find it morbid, but it can be existentially healthy to contemplate death regularly, not just during COVID-19. University of Lethbridge sociologist Reg Bibby's chart shows cancer in Canada causes roughly 13 times more deaths than COVID-19. Leading causes of death: cancer, heart disease, stroke, accidents, respiratory, seasonal flu, diabetes, Alzheimer's, then COVID-19 at 95, which is ahead of number 10, which is suicide at 4,000. And I expect suicide to race up the charts the longer this lockdown goes on. I suppose it would be even worse, if we're told that the lockdown essentially is over, but the social distancing remains, because then the restaurants, the bars, the concerts, all the rest of it, they'll realize that it's the end. Because these places cannot survive if they can hold no more than 25% of available space. It is just not possible. Again, apparently it's the xenophobia, which is the serious problem here in Canada. And we've got a lot of whining from rent seekers. Here's one named Jamie Liu. Jamie Chai Yun Liu is an immigration lawyer. That's always a good start. and an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law and Center for Health Law Policy and Ethics. She writes, the COVID-19 pandemic has come with virulent anti-Asian racism. Fear has led to the use of the term China virus. Oh dear, the revival of the slur, and I'm not going to repeat that. The perpetuation of myths that Chinese people eat bats. It's not a myth. Not a myth. An increase in they eat bats all over Asia. An increase in violent attacks against Asians and unwarranted blame placed on Filipino workers for the spread of the virus. I don't think there's any blame placed on Filipino workers for the spread of the virus. I think there's shock and anger when it turns out that you have a meatpacking plant in Alberta with close to 1,000 employees and there's no Canadians among them. Because this company Cargill decides that, no, we don't want to pay Canadians. We used to pay them $25 an hour 20 years ago. Now we're going to get by with $14 an hour. This is hard and unpleasant work, but they can get people from the Philippines and Vietnam to do this work so they can cut the Canadians out. And if any of you think that the money that they save is passed on to us, no. I reckon about 5%. It's the same with the argument that, oh, if you didn't have illegals, picking fruit and harvesting vegetables in the United States, oh, well, then a head of lettuce would cost $5. No, it doesn't work like that. Let's see. All these incidents of racism happened in a span of 8 weeks, leading to a public health concern. People who are feared and stigmatized may delay seeking care, increasing the vulnerability of that racialized population. So we racialized them. Like the Chinese, there was no such thing as the Chinese before we racialized them. And no one should have to fear violence when they step outside their door. Canada's pandemic plan needs to consider the fear that accompanies any new contagion. The whole thing is about fear. We've been told not to leave our houses. We've been told to wear masks. But of course, it's obviously the immigrants who are suffering the most. When a virus's origin is traced to Asia, the plan must include not only an evaluation of whether its measures encourage anti-Asian sentiment, but also strategies to mitigate racist perceptions that equate Asians with the virus. Racism driven by fear of infectious disease is not new. During the SARS outbreak, the public became fearful of Asians. I can't imagine why. Earlier infectious disease epidemics were associated with specific ethnic groups. The bubonic plague was linked to the Chinese in 1900, and the 1993 hantavirus infection was dubbed the Navajo disease. Oh, yeah, okay. Historically, Canada has selectively admitted some racialized persons as cheap labor, while excluding others to pacify or appease anxiety among the white population. Chinese workers were allowed in the 19th and 20th centuries, but had to pay a hefty tax. Sikhs on board the Kamagatu Maru were turned away with tragic results in 1914. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely tragic, and we've just never stopped apologizing for it. Because apparently Canadians do not have the right to control their own border. Temporary foreign workers and asylum seekers have filled labor needs in essential services. Labor needs in essential services means not hiring your own people, hiring foreigners in order such that billionaires can have more ivory back scratchers. That's what that means. There is no need to hire foreigners for these essential services. There is no need for temporary foreign workers in these jobs, and there's certainly no need for illegal immigrants in these jobs. Let's see. Scientific data show racialized persons are more likely to die from COVID-19 than white people. Boo, white people. And the difference may not be caused by pre-existing differences in wealth, health, education, or living arrangements. What I actually heard, I was told, someone on television was talking about this, the racial argument, and the assertion was seriously made that COVID-19 is a racist disease. It's a good first step that governments are collecting race-based data. Wait a minute, race doesn't exist. Race is a social construct. Race is something that we, bad white people, impose on others, hence racialized people. Well, she's really got that cognitive dissonance working for her here. More action is required, of course it is. All governments must acknowledge that how people perceive the spread of this virus can place a disproportionate burden on racialized persons, and that racialized people will experience the pandemic differently whether they are Asian, Black, Indigenous, or Latinx. Race-based analyses must be part of all public health measures in a pandemic. Yeah, and I thought Wikipedia is not always reliable in these things, but I don't know that Wikipedia is generally considered to be a racist or anti-Asian site. Yes, humans hunt 64 species of bats in Asia, though the intensity of hunting varies by regions. And apparently they like everywhere. Bats everywhere except for Singapore for some reason. Perhaps it is banned there. In East Asia, specifically southern China, bats are sometimes eaten and can be found in some markets. Specific bat species eaten in China include the cave nectar bat, Pomona roundleaf bat, Indian flying fox, and Leschenault's rosette. Okay, so China has picked a feud with Jason Kenney, the premier of Alberta. Kenney warned that China would soon face a great reckoning for it handled the outbreak of the novel coronavirus in the Chinese city of Wuhan. And just the language, this Bolshevik language. Mr. Premier, attacking China to please Mr. Trump will not work. A final friendly reminder for the Premier, you are based in Edmonton, not in Ottawa, and your China-blaming comment might not please Mr. Trump, because he will not spare a glance, let alone those American audiences, or many of them are not fond of Mr. Trump, but instead have profitable and unshakable businesses with China. They should really get some native Canadians, you know, just to get the rough edges off it. Because I'm just imagining some commissar in an army uniform barking orders at me. Okay, Canadian economy, absolutely devastated, smashed. What are we going to be looking at here? 30%, 40% unemployment? And this is what we get. The role immigrant labor is playing to keep the country moving during the COVID-19 pandemic is proof of why robust immigration must continue in the aftermath, Federal Immigration Minister Marco Mendocino said Friday. His parents were immigrants from Italy. While the health and safety of Canadians must be assured before the doors of the country can be opened as widely again, they will be. He believes Canadians would want it that way. Immigration is fundamentally about people coming together to build a stronger economy, and that is an enduring value that I believe in, that I have faith in Canadians, that they believe in, that we will see endure long after COVID-19 is behind us. There are no jobs for these people. No jobs for these people. So Stephen Harper boasted that he did not decrease immigration during the recession that followed the 2007-2008 economic panic. The Liberals are going to go further. They are increasing the number of immigrants to my country. 341,000 permanent residents this year, 351,000 in 2021, and 361,000 in 2022. The government wants you replaced, and it doesn't matter whether it's conservative government or a liberal government, liberal, Tory, same old story. Quite literally, you know, I've known these people. I've talked to them. I've listened to them at length. I've read what they've had to say. They believe that Canadians are inferior to foreigners. The foreigners are just better than us in every conceivable way, and thus Canadians must be replaced. Back to Joe Biden. Biden says he would revoke Keystone XL permit. Campaign says so. Joe Biden to the province of Alberta, drop dead. Oh, is Ronan Farrow too good to be true? I cannot look. I seriously cannot look at his depraved face. There's a long, long piece in the New York Times by Ben Smith about Pulitzer Prize winning reporter Ronan Farrow, who was famously the son of Woody Allen and Mia Farrow. Although, ungallantly, one might say, Mia Farrow has been hinting in recent years that Frank Sinatra is actually the father. I suppose because Farrow is rather a good-looking young man, and what the assumption is that an ugly father cannot have a good-looking son. Well, that's not true. But yes, he has delivered revelatory reporting on some of the defining stories of our time, but a close examination reveals the weaknesses in what may be called an era of resistance journalism. A bit sloppy, a bit economical with the actuality. That is the criticism from the New York Times. People who love Ronan Farrow have been saying, "Oh, the New York Times must be prepared, or he must be preparing Ronan Farrow some sort of expose, which is going to shake everybody up." I have to say that I do not like this fellow. And the most recent reason why I don't is because he got Hachette not to publish his father's memoir, claiming that it was outrageous that he and others, members of his family, didn't have an opportunity to read it in advance and to make changes to it. He's the censor, he's the king, the emperor, the dictator of the book world. That's not how these things work. Memoirs like Woody Allen's are read for libel, and that's that. Woody Allen has certain opinions on what happened with Mia Farrow and her adopted children, which obviously do not coincide with Ronan Farrow's. I would point out that Woody Allen was investigated exhaustively twice, and there was found to be no foundation to the charges against him. Also point out that Mia Farrow's family is crazy, that they're associated with disaster, that Mia Farrow has a brother who's in prison right now for being a pedophile. And another one of her sisters was involved in one of the most notorious recent murder cases in the United States. Glenn Greenwald makes the point that he has a similar point to what Ben Smith has to say. He writes, what's particularly valuable about Smith's article is its perfect description of a media sickness born of the Trump era that is rapidly corroding journalistic integrity and justifiably destroying trust in news outlets. Smith aptly dubs this pathology resistance journalism, by which he means that journalists are not only free but encouraged and incentivized to say or publish anything they want, no matter how reckless and fact-free, provided their target is someone sufficiently disliked in mainstream liberal media venues and/or social media. In assailing Farrow for peddling unproven conspiracy theories, Smith argues that such journalistic practices are particularly dangerous in an era where conspiracy theories are increasingly commonplace. Ever since Donald Trump was elected, and one could argue even in the months leading up to his election, journalistic standards have been consciously jettisoned when it comes to reporting on public figures who, in Smith's words, are most disliked by the loudest voices, particularly when such reporting swims ably along with the tides of social media. Put another way, as long as the targets of one's conspiracy theories and attacks are regarded as villains by the guardians of mainstream liberal social media circles, journalists reap endless career rewards for publishing unvetted and unproven, even false attacks on such people, while never suffering any negative consequences when their stories are exposed as shabby frauds. And in the case of Ronan Farrow, much of that particular debate depends on how one views the unique journalistic challenges of Me Too reporting, though one of the most embarrassing mistakes Smith flags was unrelated to sexual assault claims. Farrow's breathless and ultimately misguided allegation that the Trump administration destroyed records involving former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen, a blockbuster revelation mindlessly and predictably hyped by MSNBC's primetime on-air personalities. Finally, I'm going to talk about a story which, again, I think no, this can't be happening because it's too crazy. But here we are. This is again from Paul Joseph Watson in Summit News. A transgender Twitch Safety Advisory Council member who identifies as a deer, D-E-E-R, yes, really, bragged on a live stream about having the power to censor critics, asserting some people should be afraid of me. Twitch is a live streaming video platform that has become notorious for its draconian levels of censorship, which in many cases outstrip even YouTube. Last week, transgender streamer Steph Lauer, aka Ferociously Steph, who was born a man and apparently had his genitals removed, was announced as a new member of Twitch's Safety Advisory Council, giving Lauer the power to influence terms of service and potentially ban individual users. Before we get to Steph's comments on this, let's get to know Z a little better. Here, Lauer explains how he likes to prance around in his backyard, acting like a deer while munching on grass. He has these fake antlers in different colors. I don't know, made of pipe cleaners or something. Correct me if I'm wrong. Do female deer have antlers? I'm assuming that he's identifying as a female deer. In this clip, Lauer mules like a deer while having a, quote, deergasm, unquote, as his lover massages his head. Here's Lauer tweeting about what happens to be a sex change operation, remarking, quote, if your testicles make you depressticles, it's time to put them to resticles, unquote. A lot of emojis there in this tweet. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. That's of a lot of emojis. Here we discover that Lauer thinks that many gamers are white supremacists, and that's a fact, he says. As you can tell, Lauer is obviously a really balanced individual who would totally be expected to remain impartial and neutral when deciding what opinions are allowed to be voiced on Twitch. YouTuber Keemstar highlighted how Lauer is now bragging about having the power to censor critics who made fun of him for identifying as a deer, commenting, Twitch really needs to put an end to this. It really is going to cause something like a Gamergate. I really believe this. In the clip, Lauer states, I have power. They can't take it away from me. And honestly, there are some people that should be afraid of me. And that they are because I represent moderation and diversity. And I'm going to come for people. If you're a really shitty person, I'm going to stand up against you, period. And Twitch is endorsing me to do that. This is pretty much like all the authoritarians who want to control your speech, thoughts, and administer punishments to you if you disagree with them, remarked YouTuber Count Dankula. This one, as soon as she got the power, her mask didn't slip. She ripped it off and frisbeed it over the horizon. Okay. As the Ralph retort highlights, Lauer's ascension to becoming a Twitch moderator was almost certainly helped along by the Anti-Defamation League. The promotion actually goes back 2 years. This isn't something that just happened out of the blue. The ADL has been working overtime to get its hooks into gaming. Too much money and influence on the table for them to ignore. These are the kind of people who now have the power to control free speech online. From a broader perspective, these are the kind of people being handed power over society, and we wonder why we're in such a mess. I want to talk about, the experts in the medical community, because we all worship doctors now, nurses and so-called frontline workers. The Hippocratic Oath states, first do no harm. A doctor or a panel of doctors decided that a young man who decided that he was actually female and a deer should accede to his request to remove his testicles. This is what doctors do now. This is the state of medical science. I'm not a man. I'm not a human man. I'm a female deer. So I need my testicles removed. And you, doctors, are going to do this for me. Yeah, sure, okay, that sounds totally legit. It sounds like something a totally normal person would do. I was talking to someone who's a fan of the show the other day, or he was DMing me and saying that he had introduced this show to some of his friends, but they had been critical, saying that I was a cynic. I don't believe I'm a cynic. I think that I'm a realist, although in terms of what governments and experts tell me, I suppose I could be accused of cynicism in that regard, because I simply do not trust them. Again, we're living in a world like people like Ferociously Steph actually exist. They have huge fan clubs, and they're given socio-political power. And I look at a situation like this, and I think, it reminds me of what Theodore Dalrymple said about communist propaganda, that it was designed to drive people insane, because you were being forced to publicly agree with things that could not possibly be true. I'm going to have a final look at the chat here. Don from Beyond says, my elder son has a Tesla. He loves it. Have you seen the pictures of this so-called Tesla truck? It just looks like a monstrosity to me. Okay, what else do we have here? Okay, then again, Trump seems, okay, we got that already. Oh, no more comments. Joy Division, what Ian Curtis, he killed himself 40 years ago today. In my current state, considering some of the things that have gone on recently, I don't know that it would be such a good idea for me to listen to Joy Division, as much as I love that band. And that was from Anne Run. Driss Doodoo says, don't go overboard with those nature power gods. Okay. Doctors doing trans surgeries are not representative of all medicine. Come on, KMG, you know that, says Tom Anderson. At Johns Hopkins University in Maryland, which pioneered this, they stopped doing this some years ago, came to the conclusion that it was pointless and destructive, and the fellow who made the decision became one of the most hated people in American medicine. It is representative of medicine, Western medicine. It simply is representative, because this isn't a question of some cowboys, like plastic surgeons who engage in unnecessary plastic surgery, grotesque plastic surgery. You hear them called out. Strangely enough, they don't seem to be drummed out of the profession. But doctors who do these kinds of things to people who believe that they are female deers and not human males, they all remain perfectly respected and even lauded. Members of the community, and the medical community has been at the head of a movement to punish all people who criticize these kinds of actions. So no, I don't think that I am too cynical. How about New Order, Kevin? I like New Order, not as much as Joy Division. I suppose I like the earlier stuff better than the later stuff before they got into ecstasy. That movie, Closer, the biopic done by the Dutch photographer Anton Corbijn, highly recommended, by the way. Interestingly, most of it had to be filmed in Nottingham because there's not very much of the traditional Manchester left. Anyway, that's the show for today. I'm going to be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you clicked on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already. If you would like to support the show, my PayPal address is kevin_grace@hotmail.com. And I will leave you with my now traditional benediction and farewell, which is in these times of total social isolation. I do dearly hope that all of you manage to find some kind of genuine human connection. Good night.